Let's start. Thank you so much for having me. So this is joint work with Christine Parlour, and we're looking at market power in Bitcoin. So DeFi was started on the promise that we replace all the greedy bankers up there with a decentralized protocol that gives us the freedom and opportunities. So we disintermediate a lot of people. As it turns out, this is probably not really what happened. So Bitcoin is the biggest and largest cryptocurrency today. So we see about 300,000 transactions on a day and about $55 billion in trading volume. So this is probably also outdated. It's probably much larger market cap today. So what we want to look at is, does Bitcoin work as a decentralized settlement system? Does it work for the people to provide efficient settlement? And the answer is no. We've just replaced the greedy bankers with greedy miners, and we argue that there's about $300 million excessive fees that are being paid every year by users. So if we think about how does a Bitcoin transaction work, so we post the transaction into the peer-to-peer network, the mempool. It gets distributed. People can attach a fee to that. The miners can then go around and pick one of the transactions that they would like to include in the block and put them in the block. So the miners then get all the fees of the transactions they include. They also get the block reward. But since the block reward is fixed and known, we don't really look at that too much. So the daily fee revenue was about $40 million in 2025 March. So Bitcoin miners provide a service. The service is settlement to include the transaction in the block. And when we think about mining, we often think it's very competitive. And it's truly competitive in the sense that everybody tries to find the next block. But is it also competitive in the sense of, do they offer competitive fees? And what we argue is that this is not, because at the time that the miner decides which transaction to include in the block, the miner is for a short period of time more or less a monopolist. So the miner decides which transactions are in. And why is this type of competition different from a classic oligopoly? Think about 3 gas stations on a street corner. The gas station that has a lower price attracts much more traffic. All the cars are going to go to the gas station that has the lower price. In Bitcoin mining, if I'm a miner and I say, I'll include transactions with low fees as well, that doesn't give me more transactions. That doesn't mean that more transactions will come to me, because the miner's market share is more or less fixed, and the miner's market share depends on the computation power of the miner. And so therefore, there's no gain in market share that I can have from offering lower fees. Also, the past behavior is observable, and it's a repeated game. If I work on keeping fees high, there's a good chance that I mine the next block or the block afterwards, and therefore I want to keep fees high. So what we want to look at is, does competition work in this market? So we use data from the starting block until 2023, so about 900 million transactions. We look at all the fees paid, user characteristic, transaction characteristics. So we also have some mempool data in our sample from some aggregated, sometimes detailed, that we collected from our own node. So we compare the outcomes that we see in the data to outcomes that we would expect from a perfectly competitive market, and we see what is a closer match. And what we find is that the data points more to strategic capacity management to maximize profits rather than to be a competitive market. So let me show you a little bit. We build a model. Let me quickly walk you a little bit through the model, how we think about competition in this setting. So at time 1, new orders enter the mempool. The miners select which transactions to include. One miner finds the nose, adds the block, and then very old transactions in the mempool get flushed, but every transaction stays for 2 periods in. We have 2 types of agents who can process, put transactions in. So there's a high type, which gets some value VH out of the transaction to be included, but the high type is impatient and wants to get the transaction in within 1 block. We have a low type who gets a lower value if the transaction gets processed, but the low type is willing to wait 2 blocks to be included. So everybody's rational. The agents have beliefs about how the fees reflect that their transaction gets included into the block, and the agents cannot change their bids once they're submitted. Okay, so in such a world, how should we think of a miner who maximizes fee revenue, right? So the way we think about this is that the miners look at the fees and include the transaction with the highest fees into the block. So if there's no capacity limit, then I will include every transaction. If there's some block space, I will at least fill up the block completely. Right? So if miners are really competitive, if somebody pays me an epsilon and I have empty space, why not take the epsilon? So this has 2 implications. So if the miners include every transaction, if the blocks are not full, then the fees should be 0. Because I know that the block is not going to be full. I rationally anticipate that the miner is going to include my transaction anyway, so I just put in a very low fee, something close to 0, right? Because the miner will take it anyway. And the other thing we should see is that we should not see that lower fee transactions are processed before higher fee transactions. If the miner always looks to maximize fee revenue, I will always take the highest fee transactions first and then the low fee transactions afterwards. So how does this look? Are blocks full in practice? And the answer is no. So the orange line here shows you the fraction of empty blocks over Bitcoin's life. And yes, at the beginning, nobody used Bitcoin, and so a lot of blocks were empty. But what is surprising, we still see today empty blocks being mined. So about 1.5% of all the blocks are empty today. So the red portion shows you the number of full blocks. And you would guess that when you read the newspaper, there is a lot of demand for Bitcoin transactions, fees are high, everything. You would expect blocks to be full, but the fraction of full blocks is actually not that large. And here in blue, you see the average usage of Bitcoin. And there's times when it's fairly well used, but there's also very often there's a lot of transactions that are empty. So on average, there's about room for about 167,000 transactions for the day. And is this because there's no demand for transactions? So one potential explanation why blocks are not full is nobody wants to put in a transaction at that time. And we look at that in the mempool, and the mempool is not empty. So there's always demand for transactions, but these transactions are not included in the block. So this looks like there's money left on the table, right? So why, if I can make an extra fee dollar by including this transaction, why would I not take it? Otherwise, it seems irrational. So here we look at this money left on the table, and so this is in thousands of dollars, and you can see that there's quite a lot of money daily that's left on the table. So it looks like miners on purpose are not smart enough to leave hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table. No, they are very smart, and we argue that's because miners use a much more sophisticated strategy. We also look at these violations where a low fee transaction gets included, but the higher fee transaction that was waiting in the mempool does not get included. And we see that if you look here at the fraction, then, and I'm eyeballing this, about 20%, 10 to 20% on average of the transactions are these fee violations. So we do see that quite often. So how could we explain this? So we think about a more sophisticated strategy that these miners could follow, and if they think beyond one block. So think about this, the strategic miner, so everybody is myopic. Every miner, think about all the other miners, just take every transaction that has a positive fee. What would one strategic miner do? So the miner says, I have a probability eta of finding a block, and I want to maximize my revenue. So what do? You offer a menu of fee and wait time to the users and say, well, if you want to include immediately, you have to pay a fee FH, or you pay me a fee FL, a lower fee, and you get processed immediately with some probability, or you have to wait for one block. So this way I can price discriminate between the impatient miner, impatient user who really wants to get included in the first block, and the patient user who is willing to wait for 2 blocks. I can offer them a lower fee. And now, if I offer this menu of contracts, I can extract more money from the users. So what do the users have to think about when they post a transaction? So think about the high type. The high type gets VH when the transaction gets included. If she poses a fee here, the high fee, then she gets processed immediately, either by the myopic miner who is happy to take any fee, or by the strategic miner as well. So this user will always get processed and settled. Or the other strategy would be to pose a fee of 0 and hope that you get a myopic miner. The myopic miner will take any transaction, but the strategic miner will not. So there's a certain risk that you don't get settled, and so you only get settled when you meet a myopic miner. And in this case, you would get this payoff, which is higher now because you pay a fee of 0. Similarly, the low fee guy has a similar trade-off. And then we have to make sure that there is no mimicking, so that the high guy doesn't pretend she's a low type. So these constraints allow the miner to set up fee revenue. And what we plot here is the fee that the strategic miner would optimally charge as a function of the market power. So obviously, fees increase with the market power of the miner. And so, but what we do see is that even if the miner has a market power that's relatively small, 20%, which most of the large mining pools have today in that range, we do see that the miner can charge a significant fee to the users, especially the high fee users, and also some fee to the low fee, to the more patient users. So we do see that these miners then actually have market power. And what we especially see is also that there's a fee spread. There's a big spread between fees depending on your user type, and that fee spread is actually increasing in the market power of strategic miners. So how does this work in practice? We do see in practice these websites where you can go to that tell you, well, I'm willing to wait up to 6 blocks. Here's my transaction. How much should I pay for that? And they show you a little picture that says if you pay more money, then your wait time is lower. So how long do you have to wait for different fees that you're willing to pay? And so there's these websites out there who take that information from past data on the blockchain. So what the miners have to do is they have to make the system work. they have to delay some transactions. They have to forgo some transactions where people say, I'm willing to pay a fee for that, but they have to say, no, you're not in. You have to wait to get processed in the next block. And these delayed transactions accumulate in a mempool, and so there's an incentive to become myopic. So at some point in time, if all these juicy fees add up in the mempool, you could say, well, I'd rather milk all the transactions from the mempool, and I'll take all the transactions because there's so many juicy transactions waiting in the mempool. So we can figure out, using this logic, when our miners want to become strategic and when do they want to become myopic. So what this picture shows is the market share of these strategic miners, and this is what an individual miner would think. So the first guy who shows up is miner number 1. He has a 30% market share, and so if he becomes strategic, that's also 30% here on this axis. So miner number 1 is in the white area, which means they want to be a strategic miner. So on top of the 30%, now comes another miner with 20% market share. Miner 2 also wants to become strategic. Miner 3 wants to become strategic. Miner 4 now sees that 70% of the other miners are strategic. So for miner number 4, who is a small miner, doesn't make a huge difference. That miner becomes myopic and takes all the transactions in. So if we believe in this strategic mining, then we have some empirical implications. So first, blocks are not filled up to capacity. So I hope I could show you that. We can see this priority violation. I showed you a picture for that. What else do we get from this strategic behavior? Users with high valuations will pay high fees. Fee dispersion is high, as I showed you before in the picture. So the difference between the person who pays the very high fee is much larger than the person who is a little bit more patient. And the mining concentration matters. So the higher is the HHI of miner concentration, the stronger these results will be. So we look at the data, and I don't want to show you all the results here in the interest of time, but what we do find is that these high fee users pay very high fees. And who pays these high fees? So these are users who transfer Bitcoin to exchanges and gambling sites. These are probably keen people. So we see that they pay significantly higher fees. So who's users who pay to exchanges when the kimchi premium is high? So the kimchi premium is the price difference between Bitcoin in Korea and the US. So there's opportunities to make money. So and therefore these people then pay really high fees. So these are keen people that want to take advantage of this kimchi premium before it goes away. When the Bitcoin are spent again soon, during weekdays when Bitcoin futures are trading, because it's probably more institutional investors, we see that the fee spread decreased after the Silk Road closure. And we argue that this is probably because a lot of people who were buying guns and other illegal stuff on Silk Road were the keen people. And now that these keen people are going away, fees drop. The fee spread decreases. And the fee spread went up after this mining accident in China, which caused for a short time for a lot of Bitcoin miners to go offline. So there's a supply shock. And so then the fee spread, actually fees in general go up, but more noticeable, the fee spread goes up. The difference between what the keen people pay and the patient people pay. Yes?
May I ask what caused the mining accident?
There's a flooding in a coal mine. And so then the Chinese government shut down these power plants, and a lot of Bitcoin miners had no electricity.
Yeah, so you're punning on mining there.
Yeah, right. It was really a mining accident. Okay, to give you some illustration on this fee spread, when we read in the newspapers about what Bitcoin fees cost, and a lot of papers also use some kind of average Bitcoin fee, but the average is really a very bad measure to look at Bitcoin fees. So this is the low end of the distribution. So you see here kind of the minimum fee, and the red line is the 75% quartile of the fee, and this was in December 2017, the first time Bitcoin went over $10,000. So these fees here, the median fee goes to about $35 at the time. And so that's not exorbitant, that's high, but it's not exorbitant high. So if you look at the top end of the fee distribution, you see here the maximum fee that was paid. It's in the thousands of dollars. So there were people that paid over $10,000 to get a Bitcoin transaction through. So why on earth, if you see that, you can see everything. You can see all the transactions that are waiting. You can see everything. If the average guy pays $35, and I'm super keen, I would bid 100, but I would not bid 10,000. Right? So something is interesting is going on here. Why are people paying? And this is not an outlier where somebody made a fat finger mistake. This is consistent that we see a lot of transactions that were bidding up in the thousands of dollars in fee. And so when I came to Canada, the advice that I got when you see a bear is that you don't have to run faster, you just have to run faster than the others, which of course is bad advice because you shouldn't run when you see a bear. But it's totally unclear why somebody pays this much in fees, right? So, and we argue this is because miners have market power. If you want to be included quickly, you have to pay that much, otherwise you have to wait. Yeah.
Are you excluding miners' own transactions because they could put and pay this fee for themselves?
Yes, we include miners' own transactions. We see that.
I mean, it's perfectly fine. You know, if I include my own transaction, $10,000 fee to myself, I'm fine.
Yeah, that's right. No, we include miners' own transactions. Yeah. So we look at fee spreads. So we look at a more general definition of fee spread, which is that we exclude all the very extreme ones. We look at the difference between the 90% quantile and the 10% quantile. We look at fee spread, and we do see that that fee spread is positively correlated with the HHI of mining concentration. So the more concentrated mining is, and the more blocks are mined by mining pools, we see that that fee spread is going up. And we control for a bunch of other characteristics of the transaction. So block arrival times is another thing we try to utilize to show our point. So mining blocks don't arrive on average every 10 minutes, but in practice, it's quite a distribution. So you can, quite often, it takes 40 minutes for another block to arrive. So if there is strategic capacity management and the miners strategically manage capacity, we should see that these empty blocks, these block wait times, have some kind of effect on fees. So what we do is we regress here block weight on the frequency of recent blocks. So what we would expect is that if there has been a lot of blocks recently, then the blocks are smaller. And we look at mempool, there's always demand in a mempool for a transaction, so that's not a problem. The blocks are not small because there was no demand for transactions. The blocks are small because the miners don't include that many transactions. So what we see is that this is indeed the case. So that when there was a lot of blocks recently that blocks are smaller. And this is, when we interact this with the HHI of mining concentration, we find that it is only the case when mining is very concentrated. When mining is not concentrated, we don't see any effect. So we give a kind of rough ballpark estimate of how much does the economic magnitude of this, and we look at the sum of total fees that were paid and what we think are excessive fees. So excessive fees that were paid by users on time of our sample is about $2 billion. So, and you can use different quantiles for what is excessive, but it seems that this is an economically significant amount. So do we know this is collusion or not? Of course we don't. We don't have any particular evidence that the miners work together or not. But as we show in our theory model, the important fact here is market power. And if you're a large enough miner, you want to behave strategically, even if the other miners don't. There's an incentive to mine strategically, and therefore we see the effects, we predict the effects that we see in the data. To summarize, blockchain allows us to see this, to examine this completely unregulated market. What we see in the data is that there's consistently underused capacity, and the relationship between fees and capacity is consistent with price discrimination. Any miner who is sufficiently large has an incentive to become strategic, and competition here is different from classic oligopoly competition as we're used to it, and therefore there's no incentive to lower prices or improve welfare in this case. Yes?
So you used the word transaction.
Mm-hmm.
And, have you tried to cluster transactions? So I presume that when you're using the word transactions, they're a classical transaction. Unspent transaction now I put forks into two forks, right? But many of them are, we have 17 different legs out of that. Or it's a transaction where miner receives Coinbase and then puts part of that Coinbase into another miner's account and part of it to its change. So what I'm trying to say is that some these transactions probably would cluster around different heterogeneous types. And perhaps one way to look at robustness of your results, which appear to be robust, is just to say, if you look at a very classical transaction, the ones that, that you can say, well, this is a transaction, this is the simplest transaction you can imagine, but there are 70% of those, let's say, transactions. And maybe that changes over time. Maybe over time we're seeing more complex transactions with a lot more legs, which have to be verified. So miners need to spend energy verifying, a lot more energy verifying this versus verifying that, right? So they may not be interested, even though there's a fee there saying, look, there's just so much verification going on.
Yeah, the verification cost is totally trivial, right? So based on the,
right?
No, it is totally trivial.
Right, so transactions do appear different, right?
Yeah.
Different types of clusters of transactions.
Yeah, so we can certainly look at that. The verification cost of a Bitcoin transaction can be done in milliseconds, and it can be done offline. But yes, we can look at different types. We control at the moment for number of outputs. We control for transaction weight. So we control for a lot of different transaction characteristics in our control variables. So we use this as controls in our regression. We haven't done clustering. But
it's trivial for you.
It's fairly easy to do, yeah.
But there is some, at least anecdotal evidence, that some miners start mining on an empty block right after they hear about a block, before they do all this kind of validation stuff. So probably difficult to address this empirically, but maybe one thing you could do is exclude blocks from this analysis that have been mined within, say, a second or two after another block.
We have
Think about this behavior, right?
We have done this. This doesn't make really a difference. So the idea that this is network latency or something, I mean, Bitcoin is so slow compared to any other blockchain, right? So if you compare that to Ethereum, you have block times of 12 seconds, there's MEV calculations going on in between transactions reordering, there's auctions for block space, there's so much going on, and that all happens in 12 seconds and is far more complex. And then people argue, oh, it's latency, the miners don't know about this. No, come on, this is not the case, right? Otherwise, Ethereum wouldn't even work. And we're not even talking about Solana or layer 2 chains that have even faster block times. I don't think it's latency. I mean, otherwise Ethereum would break down.
Well, I agree. You still read these stories of miners doing exactly this, right? Maybe there's.
Yeah, but these stories are back from the, I don't know, they're 10 years old, a lot of them, yeah. But I don't believe that. But, I mean, we can neither confirm nor deny what really miners are doing, right? But, yeah. Okay, thank you very much.